Tonight, following the conclusion of Shabbat, Ariel, Amalia, and I, along with my parents and Ariel's parents, are leaving on a trip to southern Spain. And the only way we could really do this with the 20-month-olds was with 4 built-in babysitters, so we're very happy about that. And you may be surprised to learn that the site that I'm most excited to visit is not the El Tránsito Synagogue in Toledo, nor is it Maimonides Synagogue in Cordoba. In fact, it's not a Jewish site at all. What I'm most excited to see on this upcoming trip to Spain is the tomb of a Christian saint, Ferdinand III, the 13th century king of Castile. When Ferdinand died, his son, Alfonso the Wise, commissioned a tomb for his father to be built in the Cathedral of Seville, inscribed with the 4 languages of the realm: Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Castilian. And those 4 languages together sit comfortably next to one another on Ferdinand's tomb because in Spain, in the centuries leading up to 1492, the people who spoke those languages, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, lived comfortably next to one another in a society that was defined by tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Now, admittedly, and I have to say this because my wife is a scholar of medieval history, and she told me I have to say this, that vision is somewhat of an idealized vision of medieval Spain. Things were not always as rosy as we sometimes make them out to be. For example, on December 30th, 1066, exactly 956 years ago yesterday, by the way, thousands of Jews were massacred by fundamentalist Berbers in Granada. But broadly speaking, in the centuries leading up to the Inquisition, medieval Spain was the model of peaceful coexistence. Jews, Christians, and Muslims flourished together, both culturally and economically. In Muslim Spain, Jews spoke Arabic. They were heavily influenced by Arabic poetry and Islamic philosophy, and they even rose to positions of great political prominence. And to some degree, that continued in Christian Spain as well. In the 14th century, 100 years before the Inquisition, Shmuel Halevi served as the treasurer for King Pedro of Castile. And none of that would have been possible had Spain not cultivated and nurtured a culture of tolerance and peaceful coexistence. And what I want to say this morning in my final sermon of the year is that what happened in medieval Spain is not an anomaly, and it does not need to be an anomaly. In fact, something similar happened in the 20th century as well. Many of you may have heard that early this morning, Pope Benedict XVI died at the age of 95, and I started preparing the sermon when he was sick, so I knew this was coming. And despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that he was born in Germany and was a member of the Hitler Youth during the Holocaust, Pope Benedict was particularly sensitive to Jewish concerns, and he deeply emphasized the significance of maintaining positive Jewish-Christian relations throughout his time as Pope. In 2006, just a year after he was elected as Pope, Benedict visited Auschwitz, where he publicly castigated the Nazis for failing to see the Jews of Europe as human beings created in the image of God, just like all other people on earth. And in a very powerful and moving speech that he delivered that day, and you can watch this speech on YouTube, Pope Benedict said that by attempting to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth, the Nazis were also destroying the roots of Christianity. In fact, he went so far as to accuse the Nazis of trying to kill God. God who called to Abraham, God who spoke to Moses at Sinai, and God who laid down the principles which would serve as the guiding light for all of humanity. Principles which are eternally valid not only for Jews, but for Christians as well. And throughout his time as Pope and before he retired, and by the way, he was very famously the first Pope in 6 centuries to step down from the position, and there's a great movie about that where he's played by Anthony Hopkins. Pope Benedict visited synagogues all over the globe, including the Park East Synagogue on the Upper East Side. He developed a very close relationship with the rabbi and scholar Jacob Neusner, who I'm proud to say was a conservative rabbi. And in 2009, he paid a very, very important visit to Israel, where he spoke passionately about the Holocaust at Yad Vashem. And that visit is widely understood to be a milestone moment in the history of Jewish-Christian relations. But none of what Pope Benedict accomplished would have been possible if not for another pope, the pope I really want to speak about this morning, and that's Pope John the 23rd. On October 17th, 1960, Pope John famously invited a group of 130 leaders, many of whom were rabbis, to a meeting at the Vatican. And when the Jewish delegation arrived, Pope John stepped down from his papal throne and he greeted that group of Jews with words from this morning's Torah portion, the very same words that Joseph used when he finally revealed himself to his brothers after having not seen them for over 2 decades. Ani Yosef achichem. I am Joseph, your brother. And in using that verse, Pope John was actually quipping on his own name. His given name was Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, and of course Giuseppe is the Italian version of Joseph. But beyond being a clever pun, Pope John very intentionally chose to open his meeting with those words because he was channeling the spirit of Joseph from this week's Torah portion. Just as Joseph wanted to remind his brothers that despite decades worth of hatred and animosity, ultimately they were still brothers, so too did Pope John want to remind the Jews that despite centuries worth of persecution and tension, ultimately Jews and Catholics are still brothers. And as Pope John conveyed that day, there is no reason that the frayed relationship between Jews and Catholics can't be repaired. And that very important meeting led directly to Pope John initiating the Second Vatican Council, what we know as Vatican II, which officially banned any form of theologically based anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church and repealed the classical Christian belief that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. In so many ways, 2022 has been a year defined by anti-Semitism. It began with the shooting in Colleyville, Texas, and it ended with Kanye West and Kyrie Irving bringing anti-Semitism to the forefront of all of our minds. But as we conclude this year and we begin the next, I want to remind us that it hasn't always been this way, and it doesn't need to be this way. And despite the way that it sometimes might feel, there are millions of Christians and Muslims and peoples of all faiths who celebrate and appreciate and love the Jewish people. As vice president of the Livingston Interfaith Clergy Association, I am so privileged to work with and collaborate with people like that almost every day. And as we conclude 2022 and we begin 2023, that's what I hope we can focus our energy on in the new year. That's what we should be celebrating and uplifting, not hatred and animosity, but love and companionship and brotherhood. I've told this story from the Bima before, but as we conclude 2022, this is the message above all else that I want to leave us with. Once, many years ago, in a small village, 3 friends, a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew, farmed on adjoining land. The Muslim farmer observed the Sabbath on Friday, the Jewish farmer observed the Sabbath on Saturday, and the Christian farmer observed the Sabbath on Sunday. And one Friday afternoon, after the Christian farmer had finished plowing his fields, he noticed that the field of his Muslim friend had not yet been plowed. If he doesn't plow it today, he said to himself, it could rain tomorrow, and then he won't be able to finish his planting. I should plow his field for him to ease his burden. And so he did. And when the Muslim farmer saw that his field was plowed, he rejoiced. Surely, he said, God had sent angels to plow my field while I observed the day of rest. And a few months later, on a Sunday, the Jewish farmer noticed that the field of his Christian friend was ready to be harvested. If he doesn't harvest the field today, he thought he could lose part of his crop. I should help him and pick his corn for him. And so he did. And the next morning, when the Christian farmer went out into his field, he was astonished to discover that his corn had already been harvested. "It's a miracle," he said. "While I rested, God's angels harvested for me." And finally, a few months after that, on a Saturday, the Muslim farmer noticed that his Jewish friend had not yet threshed his grain. "If my Jewish friend doesn't thresh his grain today," he said, "the rain could wash it away and he will lose his entire crop. I will gather and thresh his grain for him this afternoon." And so he did. And when Shabbat was over, the Jewish farmer was amazed to discover that his grain had already been threshed. And he too rejoiced. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, for sending angels to help me while I was observing Shabbat." That is the world that Joseph wanted to build with his brothers. That's the world that existed in medieval Spain for hundreds of years. That's the world that both Pope John and Pope Benedict sought to create. And that's the world that we should be striving to create in the new year. Hine ma tov manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good it is to dwell together as brothers and sisters in unity. Shabbat Shalom and Happy New Year. We rise now for Chatzi Kaddish, page 428.
Yikadav, Yikadash, Merabah, Yolma Divrach, Yerushalayim, Yamliach Malchutei, V'chayechon, V'yamechon, V'chayreho Beit Yisrael, V'agala Bizman Kariv, V'imruhu,
Amen. Yesh Merabah Mevorach.